My name is Sybe de Vries and I'm a professor of EU Single Market Law and Fundamental Rights at the Europeo Institute of Utrecht University. And it's a real honor and privilege to have been invited to make this short video about COVID-19 and European law. But first of all, I would like to say that I'm very sorry for the terrible impact that the virus has had, particularly in northern Italy, where so many lost their lives and loved ones as a consequence of the pandemic. As Albert Camus in The Plague famously writes, and which we should see as a request to all of us, we should go forward, groping our way through the darkness, stumbling perhaps at times, and try to do what good lay in our power. In this video, I will focus on public health and EU single market dimensions of COVID-19 first, and I will then turn to the rule of law and fundamental rights dimensions. The most immediate concern of the present crisis is, of course, the protection of people's health against the impact of COVID-19. It is thus not surprising that once the risks of the coronavirus became clear, the EU member states quite rapidly took all kinds of national measures to protect the health of their citizens. But why was there no common, or at least a more coordinated, EU response? The originally poor status of European cooperation to deal with the corona crisis can to a large extent be explained by the relatively weak legislative powers of the European Union in the field of public health. The management, organization and delivery of medical care and health services are a matter and responsibility for the member states. Meanwhile, some member states closed their borders. Others sought to restrict the exportation of medicines or of protective clothes, face masks and gloves, or to requisition these goods. The fundamental freedoms, particularly the free movement of goods and persons, constituting the cornerstone of Europe's single market, have been severely restricted. Border checks have been reintroduced in the Schengen area and the external borders of the European Union are closed. These measures, of course, have serious repercussions for EU citizens, for third country nationals, as well as refugees. Yet member states have considerable leeway in protecting the health of their citizens within the framework of European law and the internal market. According to one of the classical judgments of the European Court of Justice, the Pijper, the interest of public health ranks first amongst the interests mentioned in Article 36 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Now, Article 36 constitutes the treaty exception for national measures restricting the free movement of goods, where member states, for reasons of security of supply, for instance, prohibit or restrict the exportation of medicines or essential medical protective equipment. This is prohibited on the basis of Article 35 of the treaty, which deals with export restrictions. May thus be justified for public health reasons. Despite the importance of the public health exception in Article 36 of the treaty, member states do not have a carte blanche in shielding their national market with a view to protecting the health of its own population. But COVID-19 has shown that it has an unprecedented impact on the internal market. And the corona crisis reveals that the project of the internal market and its foundational legal principles are much less solid and more fragile than we previously thought. Now turning to the rule of law and fundamental rights dimension. As Professor of Political Science and Law Daniel Kieleman has tweeted, the pandemic will eventually end. The economy will eventually recover. But democracy, once lost, may never come back. and we are much closer to losing our democracy than many people realize. The sad relevance of this reflection is that legal steps in many member states have been taken in the shadow of the COVID-19 crisis, which challenge the prevailing rule of law ideals in Europe. According to Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union, the EU is inter alia founded on the values for democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights. Fundamental rights such as the right to move freely, the right of equal access to health services, the right of respect for private life, the right to family life, the freedom of assembly and association, data protection, and so on have been severely limited since COVID-19 has spread over Europe. The containment measures have had a huge impact on the daily life of EU citizens and their right to free movement. Most severe have been the measures impacting the elderly, who have to stay in their homes or are confined to care homes and may not receive visitors. Most significantly, in an increasing number of states across the globe and in the European Union, governments have been granted emergency powers to address the corona crisis and combat COVID-19, which, as is the case in Hungary, may even last for an indefinite period of time. And to closely monitor the situation, as the European Commission says it does, will in the end not at all be sufficient. Other fundamental rights concerns have been raised about the possible use of apps, which in the exchange of data track the spread of the virus, ultimately with a view to understand its course and to contain it. Despite their potentially positive effects, using these apps may constitute important drawbacks, particularly where the protection of personal data is concerned. An app is not a wand which could combat an epidemic just like that, as data may not always be reliable and conclusions may well be wrong. Important legal safeguards should be introduced and scientific reliability should be guaranteed with a view to protect the value of the rule of law. We have to find an approach that balances health protection, free movement and other fundamental rights, like the protection of personal data and privacy, which are firmly laid down in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The relatively strong EU data protection regime is crucial here. As a matter of fact, the presumed conflict between the protection of public health on the one hand and fundamental rights and public interests on the other is an apparent contradiction. If we take the World Health Organization's definition of public health as our starting point, which stipulates health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The protection of the rule of law, fundamental freedoms and fundamental rights should be important values in the fight against COVID-19 as well. Thank you very much for your attention.